Sukhdev at London at the headquarters of the ICAEW, the Institute of Chartered Accountants of England and Wales, the official body of accountancy. I'm here today discussing, among other things, accounting disclosure with a very special person, and that is Jochen Zeitz. Jochen is the executive chairman of Puma, and he's also the CEO of PPR's division for sports and lifestyle. Jochen, welcome to London and delighted to have you here.
Thank you. Happy to be with you.
You've been quite a trailblazer, Jochen. You've, at Puma, done something that Teeb had recommended and many others had recommended. But to be honest, we didn't think that a company your size, $2.7 billion, $3 billion now, would come out and be able to measure and report its externalities. How did all this happen?
Well, I actually believe that the way we do business needs to change, and we CEOs like to work with numbers, and if you work with numbers, then you realize what is wrong or what isn't. So I try to find a way to look at the environment, looking at nature and business's footprint in euros and cents or pounds and pennies or dollars and cents, and it was actually you who inspired me too. While I was writing my book, Prayer, Profit and Principles, I came across the early days of Teeb,
yes.
and I said, well, how can business actually translate what you are doing and make it visible for us CEOs and CFOs and anybody in organization what the footprint really is? How can we value nature and the damage we do? And that's when the idea was born. I brought a group of people together to advise me on it, and 2 years later we were able to publish the first ever environmental profit and loss statement, which was a big eye-opener for us. Initially, of course, a lot of people thought, well, if you actually publish your environmental damage, it will probably turn into PR disaster. And I said, well, but everybody knows that business has a negative footprint. We know that human beings have a negative footprint, so why not be upfront about it? If we really want to change something, if we don't just talk but walk the walk, we really have to be transparent. I believe in transparency of business. The difficulty was then also, of course, defining how what is the actual footprint, what do we measure? Carbon, of course, comes to mind, water comes to mind, but there are others: air pollution, waste, land change, and land use. And I think after a while we just felt comfortable that the methodology that we've developed out of the vast array of studies that have been done was a good one for us. We said, well, let's publish the initial most likely biggest drivers in terms of valuing our our environmental impact. And we felt it was probably going to be carbon and water, and we ended up with around about 90 million. But when we then included the other three dimensions, we actually ended up with a total of 145 million euros. So it was quite a big step up again. Also our parent company, PPR, that I'm also supporting in terms of changing the way PPR does business to a more sustainable way of doing business. So, well, you know what, if we look at these results, this is actually a great thing. Let's do it for all the brands that are part of the PPR portfolio, which is obviously great for us, because we're talking about brands like Gucci, Stella McCartney, Alexander McQueen, and. So we're very pleased that we have more than 15 brands that will do in EP&L in the next few years. And
do you have a sort of a plan or a design to reduce these externalities step by step?
Yes, I mean, we've started, after we published the first phase, we already started to look at, okay, well, how can we change things? And the really interesting bit is like driving a Formula One car. You sort of now have visibility in the cockpit or flying a plane. You have more instruments that actually tell you what's wrong or what's working. And the most surprising, I guess, visualization of the EP&L was that the biggest impact, 57% of the impact actually happened with the production of raw materials.
Correct.
Which is significant, which means that the moment our designers or developers decide to use virgin material, which in our case is mostly leather, cotton, which is very important, of course, or rubber, natural rubber, we are already deciding 57% of our environmental impact. So with that decision, we now need to say, well, what are the alternatives? Is it cradle-to-cradle material? Is it recycled material? Is it more sustainable ways to produce leather and cotton? Leather in itself, of course, as we know, contributes to a large amount of the carbon footprint in the world. Are there alternative ways of synthetic leather? Is the chemical industry able to provide new materials that have a very reduced environmental footprint? So those are all the questions we're starting to ask now.
This is complex, but of course it's doable, and I think that's what your exercise has shown. But to what extent can this be explained to the customer?
We have legislation that will come into play, hopefully will come into play, because I think transparency is very important. We have more educations, people like you with TEEB, telling corporations, that the way we've done business in the past is no longer working. But of course, we also ultimately need to convince the consumer. And I believe that ultimately consumerism has been invented by corporations, so it's our responsibility to change consumerism and make it more sustainable. And we shouldn't be saying, well, the consumer is not willing to pay more, the consumer is not ready for it. I think those are lame excuses.
The real power of this, as we see it, comes where there are standards where all corporations have to measure and disclose their externalities. And as with any standard, it has to be only one standard for a particular type of industry. So to what extent, and of course, then it would have to be open box. It's not anyone's particular methodology, it is the methodology of the marketplace, of that industry, and of the accountancy bodies who've endorsed it. Would you, Jochen, be willing to share the work that you've done effectively with your own competition?
Oh, absolutely. I think, when it comes to the environment, nature, and society, we should cooperate. We shouldn't just compete. Yes, competition, healthy competition is good, but it's got to be healthy. And that means, nature needs to survive and not be damaged. So I think you could always say how much time is left. I believe, we shouldn't ask the question, we should just solve the problem. And in that regard, we need a standardization. We need a new playing field. Coming out of the sporting goods industry, we compete on the football pitch, but ultimately, if you realize that the rules need to change, well, you can still compete based on a new set of rules. If the game gets faster, if it gets dirty, well, you have to clean up that game, and if the referee can't keep up, well, you need to make sure that the replay comes into play. So I think there are rules that need to be adjusted, and they need to be ultimately global rules. They cannot just be national rules. But even if one country starts, I think it's the right thing to do, and it will ultimately lead to competitive advantage too. I think Germany has proven that as an industry we can be competitive, although we have higher standards maybe in terms of the environment than other countries do. And I believe companies need to do the same thing. There needs to be global regulation with regards to the new rules of doing business, and businesses need to cooperate as well. How we can standardize, of course, is always the question, but it took us 100 years to come up with our accounting scheme. We're still debating about international accounting standards, so it may take a while to standardize the EP&L and the methodologies, and they may be industry specific, but the key thing is not waiting to find the perfect methodology, but let's get started and let's be transparent and let's disclose. As long as we disclose the methodologies we use, how we've calculated something, you will always say, okay, well, it's the right step forward, because you may not be 100% correct. As long as you're going in the right direction, let's go.
If we each had our black box as to how we publish financial statements, they would not be much use to analysts and investors. I was delighted to hear an insightful comment from you, which is that consumerism was created by corporations. So the question is, whose role should it be to change consumerism or to change advertising to be more accountable?
Well, I believe it's corporations' responsibility to communicate in better ways and to find ways to excite the consumer about the new paradigm. I believe there will be many companies out there that will understand that this opportunity is there for them, and it is a profitable opportunity too. I think we need to move out of the era of business that causes collateral damage with business that causes collateral benefits. Consumer education, or actually advertising in a more sustainable way, and making people actually excited about this opportunity is something that we as businesses, in particular the branded goods businesses and the consumer goods, have to take as a challenge.
How do you respond to the wave of change that is already happening in terms of consumers being on the net and to some extent dictating the advertising that happens.
And, we have created a new community. It's no longer about the brand or the corporation talking to the consumer.
Yeah.
We're all part of a bigger community, and I think that's very important. The way we advertise has changed. It's more dialogue. It's communication, one-to-one communication. In fact, every consumer becomes an advertiser now through social networking. Every NGO becomes an advertising. Well, I always believed in the virtual corporation. In fact, we 20 years ago now, we were called the first virtual company because we got rid of our corporate headquarters, and we said, well, you know what, I don't care where people live, where they work, they're all part of our corporation, of our community. We sort of grew up, or I grew up thinking, well, business is there to make money, civil society watches over the companies, governments set the rules, and religion provides for the spiritual leadership. But I think that's kind of boxed in thinking is no longer valuable.
But some compartments still like to remain compartments, and I refer to finance. So CORP2020 has a perspective on finance, because we recognize that the last 3 major recessions have been driven by leverage and either misuse or overuse of leverage. We don't think that the new corporation, the CORP2020, can emerge without accountable advertising, but also without limiting leverage. So how would you respond to having your leverage limited?
Well, very interesting, because in my private and my business life, leverage never played a role.
Really?
It never did. I do not believe in borrowing money to live my private lifestyle, and my first experience becoming a very young CEO at the age of 30 was to actually, on my first day, talk to 12 German banks because the company was in very bad financial state, and we had a couple $100 million in debt and subordinated debt. The company was virtually bankrupt. I decided then that I would never work with leverage. I got to get rid of this, and it took us not even 12 months to get rid of the bank pool, 3 years to get rid of all the debt. We paid everything back, every penny, subordinated debt, and for ever since we were not only cash positive, we had net cash on hand. And I always said, in the crisis when I need the money from the bank, I may not get it, so I always want to have one restructuring in my cash deposit box. So I always kept around 300 million euros now in the cash of the company, in the bank account. And I said, well, if I ever need it in any financial crisis where I have to really focus on business and making sure business works well, I don't have time to talk to the banks, I need that reserve. It was from a criticized from many fund managers as the wrong thing to do, because we need to leverage up in order to improve our multiples. And I said, you know what, it's not my philosophy. So I don't believe in leverage, and I've never leveraged my private life nor my business life. So I think people's perception of leverage is changing, and it needs to be changed, but it was clearly not sustainable. And if you really believe in sustainable business, you also have to be sustainable for the long run in difficult times, and that means you can only take so much debt if you believe in debt.
And finally, looking at resources and taxing resources, what do you think of this fourth plank of change? Today we tax profits. In other words, we tax the goods, not the bads. We don't really pay much attention to the fact that if we taxed resource extraction and not so much corporate profits, the needle of change would point towards how are we using resources, why do we need to use so much?
Well, I think that is part of the problem. We are not valuing nature. And of course, you can always question, should you value nature in monetary terms? I believe as business, you need to value what you use. And we have not put a true value to that use, to the ecosystem services or natural capital that we're utilizing. And once you start to value it, you will start to manage it. If you don't have to pay for it, you take it for free, and that is no longer sustainable. But it's something that needs to be changing, and therefore I believe that ultimately taxes also need to apply at the roots, and need to work their way up. I mean, we could say our products today are subsidized by nature. That's the reality. Nature has not asked us to pay and never sent us a bill, and that actually needs to change. We have to change the way we account for nature by internalizing those costs, and it starts very much, as we've seen with the EP&L, with the creation and the production of raw materials. That's where the biggest environmental footprint happens. So that's where the tax also needs to ultimately apply. We have to think of nature that is bleeding, and we can no longer sustain itself, and we have to face the fact.
We have to do that.
We have to face the fact, and we have to start changing now. I think collaboration, cooperation is very important in this. Governments alone are not going to fix it. Business alone is not going to fix it. NGOs alone are not going to fix it, and society for sure not. Everyone, however, has a very important role to play, and if we play our own roles and start to cooperate and try to jointly find solutions, I think it can be done. But it also will require a push. Not every business is willing to do what we are trying to do, and even then, it sometimes needs a push to jump over the hurdle. And therefore, governments and legislation definitely does play a role in this, because we do not have time to lose, and therefore. It is clear that legislation needs to set in, but we also see from Copenhagen, from Durban, it's not that easy either to get the global governments to agree to one set of future, not just legislation, but objectives that need to be achieved. So ultimately, everyone needs to take responsibility and not wait for the other.
Excellent. It's been such a pleasure talking to you, Jochen.
Thank you very much.
That was Jochen Zeitz in London, speaking with me, Pavan Sukhdev. Jochen Zeitz described to us his vision of the future cooperation, one which is not a creator of collateral damage, but rather a creator of collateral benefits. A cooperation which works with consumers not as people to sell, but as parts of the community which it engenders. A cooperation that, in his case, does not use leverage. A corporation that is responsible in advertising because it uses that as a form of communication to the community to which it belongs. That, we hope, would be Corporation 2020.